Oh, you said you had a question. So
Yeah, I
first
even
things
have the
first.
role for having a question.
Yeah. Oh shit. Oh damn. All right. Green roll. What's up? What do you got for me?
Yeah, so I'm curious regarding the trans individuals in sports
Yeah.
document.
Hmm.
Well, I think that everything document is really good. I'm curious what you a lot of what the evidence hinged on was that there are ways of effectively eliminating the claimed the advantages that maybe people who are trying to keep trans people out of sports claim are present, and those include effective use of puberty blockers, effective use of other like medical transitioning
Yeah.
processes.
Hmm.
But I guess I'm curious. I'm sure you're aware there are a lot of trans people right now who partially because if you're 30 right now and trans, you likely don't have or didn't have access to the level of medical care that we would probably hope people who are trying to transition would.
Yeah.
And what do you think is like the best path forward for those people, or even people in high school or college sports who didn't get the medical access they would have liked to have gotten, maybe because of their family or because of where they lived?
Yeah.
Like, what do you think we do with those? Sorry, do with those people sounds really negative. How do you think we can get those people involved in sports effectively when maybe they're still facing the stigma and maybe even a reinforced stigma of um, because of advantages they might have?
Yeah. So I think that there's I mean there's a couple of parts of this, right? So the first thing that I want people to recognize is that like this is kind of like the way that you described it, and this doesn't directly answer the question, but I do want to make it clear that like this is a temporary issue, or it should be a temporary issue,
Gotta
in,
hope,
in an
right?
ideal world, right? Because like hopefully as we go forward, the medical profession is going to like proceed, society's going to get more accepting, and so like we're not going to end up in situations where people are coming out, at like 30. Um, people will feel more comfortable coming out earlier and getting, proper medical intervention and treatment earlier on, which will, avoid basically the entirety of these issues. And so to me, I essentially approach this with a question of, all right, so how do we deal with like a problem that only exists ideally in the short term? And essentially the way that I see that is it seems like um, most evidence suggests, well, there's two things, right? So the first is that there's like an idiosyncratic nature of testosterone, right? A lot of people imagine it that like, oh, just because you're exposed to testosterone, that automatically means that you're gonna have like some inherent biological advantage over cis women, right? But that's not necessarily true. While on the aggregate you see some like general trends of like higher performance, that's not going to be true for everyone, right? And it's especially not going to be true, if we're not talking about people, unless we're talking about people at like the highest stages of athletic competition, right? So people at like super professional levels. But so like when we're talking about most people, like people, for example, who are just like competing in local rec leagues or whatever, like, for people in those positions, we should probably not impose such a high degree of scrutiny because, like, they're probably not dealing with the same kind of advantages that we might consider for, people who have been competing in high level athletic competitions for such a long time, right? Now, if we're talking about like high level athletic competitions, like professional sports, oh my God, thank you for the raid, Pixie. I really appreciate it. But if we're talking about like, professional sporting competitions, college, pro, whatever, it seems like the literature suggests for those people that it's probably best to have like a waiting time of a certain number of years. Like one of the studies says that one is fine. Another says that more than one will probably be necessary. So, maybe like 2 or 3, but some number of years and maybe a possible measurement of like hormone levels in the blood. I know that's a policy that the National Rugby Association uses, and that seems to work just fine. And being able to use like a policy made from the combination of those kinds of rules would probably create like sufficient guidelines to be able to make it to where like it would either completely eliminate any possible inherent athletic advantage, or if not completely eliminate it, get like pretty close, right? And I'm fine with getting pretty close, Because again, we're talking about, this brings back up to like the fact that we're dealing with a largely temporary issue, right? And also the fact that like as a policy matter, there's also studies showing that like excluding trans women from sports contributes to their suicide. And I mean, like, speaking personally, like, again, I've talked about this a little bit before, but like it's already fucking terrifying enough to compete in sports or like go to any kind of athletic competition, because like there's these people with really negative stigmas towards trans people in sports and society. Like, the people who go ahead and do this are like kind of badass, to be perfectly honest, and so like while I am personally willing to like balance the considerations that a lot of people are raising in this instance, like at a certain point we have to recognize the policy matter that like we have to draw a hard line, to where we're just like, all right, whatever. We're going to ask these things of you, and if you do them and you're still able to have some athletic advantage after the fact, then like whatever. We don't want to put you in a position where you might be like a harm to yourself, and also like, like you've already been through a lot, and this is an issue that's not going to last, too much longer, right? Like ideally, right? Like, this is probably a conversation that hopefully should last for like another like maybe like 10, 20 years, if that, right? Is like,
yeah, I guess my concern is like a lot of people die in 10, 20 years from like social ostracization, and like sports can be a really, really good community.
well, yeah.
And so like, I'm not saying that you're sorry. Obviously, you're not like ignoring that fact. I'm saying like when I think of when I was reading through the document, it felt like that was a gap in like topic covered. Like, what can we do now to make either these spaces or these spaces more inclusive? Like, is there a way to have are there certain sports that have like more effective rec leagues for people who are transitioning? Like, is there a sport where the the difference between maybe the genetic difference is not as impactful?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, so there's a couple things here, right? There's certainly some sports which are going that, like, some people draw a distinction between like contact and non-contact sports. There could be a meaningful conversation to be had there, because a lot of sports will have to be handled differently. But like, we also, I don't know, we also just want to be careful that, like, for example, you brought up the idea of like a rec league for people who are transitioning. A lot of people have tried to propose the idea of like an alternative third league for trans people. And oftentimes that gets into the same problem that we had before with the social ostracization aspect, where it's like, okay, you're going to create a league that's comprised of like a handful of people. And it's essentially like the way that it's going to pan out is it's going to be panned out that like this is the league where the freaks go. It won't be like necessarily like advertised as that, but that's the way it's going to be perceived by a lot of people,
Yeah, sorry, that was my bad.
Yeah,
maybe
but
I misspoke.
I get how people can say that in like good faith, right? I'm not saying that that's the intention that you bring up with it. I'm just saying that practically, like, I've heard that kind of a suggestion before, and like that's what would happen in that circumstance, right? Or that's what is most likely would happen in that circumstance. And so like, I think that like, for me, the biggest question, like personally, because I think that like having like a waiting period of a couple years for people who are transitioning later in life, who are competing in like really high competitive athletic levels, right? Because I think that for people who are just competing in like rec leagues, like it's probably fine. Like, rec leagues are more like, as a policy matter, focused on just like trying to foster like community and like create a space where people can like get to know each other and all that. Like, I don't know, those are going to be like largely determined by the leagues themselves. And honestly, like, they're like, you can probably just let people compete without too many, if any, restrictions. But like when we're talking about high level athletic competition, or even like high school, like a lot of people, usually center the discussion on like high school athletics. There we just want to be careful because like, oh, I didn't turn in anything. Fuck me. We want to be careful because on one hand, usually like when we're talking about having like a waiting period of 2 years, while that is probably good for high schoolers,
Not
they haven't
doable.
experienced the full effects of, testosterone-based puberty. Like they're right in the middle of experiencing it, so we can probably like shorten that. And also, if we have them wait 2 to 3 years, that's like the majority of their like time to compete in high school.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we're able to adequately deal with that. And then for people who are beyond that, I mean, like we want to be able to like create some ways for people to be able to like participate. Maybe it's like a way to like essentially like, I don't know, maybe bench the team. I mean, like some way to be able to keep people involved, right? Because like the most important thing in that aspect is that like even if we can agree that like you need a certain waiting period of being on HRT to be able to compete, like if we like let's say that we make the arbitrary time like 2 to 3 years, we do still want people to be like involved and effectively like not just like hiding in a closet waiting for 2 to 3 years. Because I can tell you again, I'm gonna do some anecdote Andrea bullshit, but I mean this is also a pretty popular a pretty
Sorry, is
common
that the
experience.
female of Anecdote Andy?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
I
Never
don't know.
known before.
You can say anecdote, Andy. I don't know. I don't.
No, I've just never heard it before. It's a
Yeah.
good meme.
Oh yeah, no. Really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, like, if we're doing some anecdote Andrea bullshit, I just got completely knocked off my train of thought. Like a big risk for a lot of trans people is that like during transition, like during that that time when people are on HRT, usually there's a couple things that are true at the same time, right? The first of which being that usually people aren't out to their family. I certainly wasn't when I started. Usually people, because they aren't out to their family or because they aren't out to their significant others or their community, are in a really weird spot, personally. And usually what transitioning means is like essentially like closing yourself inside your house for like 2 years or so. This isn't necessarily true for everyone. This was just like my experience. Like essentially when I was transitioning, I was like down in the South, and I spent most of my time like back in the place where I was living, like in the places where I was living. Usually if I went out and I would like drive for Lyft, I would wear like super baggy clothing because this stuff was happening with the bod. And like and I would just like basically not really interact that much with people just because I was really scared of how people would treat me. I was in this weird in-between space. And so, and that's not, and mind you, I'm saying this like that, I'm not saying that's like a good thing, right? Like this is a very, like that is a very bad thing, right? And so what I would hope for, is that we are able to get to a place where that's not the case and where people who are going through that kind of transition period are able to come out to their families, be supported by their communities, and are able to, like be accepted and like affirmed by the people that they're close to, right? Like that would be a really mentally healthy situation to be in. And so bringing this back to the sports conversation, like most people who are transitioning, like during that 2 to 3 year period, probably are not going to be out to the world during that period anyway. At least based on my own personal experience, maybe that isn't always true. But for the people, but that's not a good thing, right? We want to be able to get to a place where
hopefully it'll be less and less the case that people have to be closeted while transitioning as we sort
yeah,
of move forward.
yeah, exactly. And we want to be able to get to a place where not only where people don't have to feel like they are pressured to stay in the closet, but also where they're able to like be able to participate in like community events and things like sports, right?
Yeah.
The in-between fucking sucks. Yes, Marie. Yes. Reliable Riley's. Wait, well, anecdote Andrea. Oh, and if you're really angry at someone, you can say anecdote Andrea. Ambivalent Amy's. Oh my god, people are just coming up with all the ways to describe this. This is amazing. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I guess I just wanted to clarify when I said earlier, like, is there a way to make recreational leagues like open to trans individuals? It wasn't like a can we just make a new rec league for trans people? It was like, how can we take, because a lot of rec leagues are like co-ed already.
Oh
And
yeah.
so it's just like, how do you work with that to just make them a little more open? Because I know that especially with rugby around my area. Like the rugby leagues are really open, but like if you go to a soccer league, it's not at all. And I was thinking like, do you ever think about like what maybe makes those differences, or what can be done to maximize how like to maximize the ease of access for trans people?
Well, I mean, a lot of that's probably going to be, I mean, like, without getting into, like, the specifics of each sport, a lot of that's probably going to have to be cultural, right? Because, I mean, like, a lot of rec league rules are written or are made, as far as I am aware, at the local level. And so, it's just going to have to be, like, kind of a cultural change in perspective to, like, make it a good policy matter, like a good ideal for people to strive towards to include others in competition, right? Because
Yeah.
usually that's, like, the big problem is that like people will actively push back against the idea of including others, which is a bad thing. That's not good. We should try to push to include people in sports who are normally in like for whatever reason like excluded from being able to participate, because I mean, like, sports are great. Like they're fun, and they make you healthy, and it's good ways to meet people and build community and all that good stuff.
Yeah, it's easy to minimize, but like sports as a community is like a huge part of a huge like I would be willing to bet that like a plurality of the population participates in sports as like a community building activity over the course of their life.
Oh
It's
yeah,
really important.
absolutely. And it really
I don't
sucks
know if
right now,
plurality
but I
works,
imagine
but
that a lot of people might, I don't know, maybe like I'm basically making an appeal to the audience right now. I can imagine that people who didn't appreciate being able to go out and like socialize with people in sports before the pandemic probably can look back and really appreciate, like, damn, I really wish I could just be able to go out and like play basketball with some people, or be able to go out and, like, I don't know, play soccer with some people, or whatever sports that kids do nowadays.
yeah,
Um, like those are fun, and it's a good way to be able to get out and just enjoy yourself. And it sucks because, like, essentially for trans people and a lot of people, right? But right now we're talking about trans people. It's essentially just like a thing which is completely, which is almost categorically unavailable for like that entire group of population. Not necessarily because of laws, though obviously laws are being pushed right now, but in a lot of ways because of culture, right? And even if the laws
yeah,
become legalized, like right now, I can go to, well, I mean, like, not right now. Before the pandemic, I could go to rec leagues and be able to like compete in leagues that I would feel most comfortable in, right? Like I could go and do that. But the thing is, for me, I'm still not I'm still not going to, because I'm scared of being treated negatively because of the culture of the people there, right?
yeah,
Competitive video games and chess use an algorithm to adjust your rank based on your performance, such as each time you win and lose, until you're matched against people who play as well as you, no matter who you are. Just measure skills. Yeah, I really like no, Pixie. Yeah, I really like the idea. Yeah, post-gender ALO system. Yeah, no, I remember you mentioned that to me before one time. And I really like that idea. Like, just have, like, basically, I don't know, like I was having a conversation. It might have been with you or with someone else on the subject. It would turn into like, oh, everyone's getting ready for the new season of baseball or whatever. The new competitive season's like, oh, are you ready? Are you ready for the new season? Oh, damn, I'm so ready to grind out my ranks and to get my ranking up. I'm gonna get into tier platinum for sure, or whatever the fuck. But yeah, no, I think that'd be really cool. And then yeah, and it would be like perfectly inclusive. And then everyone would be able to have like a high degree of competition, and it would be good. Yeah. Sadly, I don't think that would work on a local level. Yeah, well, I mean, like, I've definitely thought about that. But I could conceive of a future where it's possible. I don't know. As we'll grow and figure out more things as a society, like, that's clearly the better system. It just, we're not able to achieve it because of like a lack of technology and whatnot. I'm golf silver. Damn. Yeah, but I don't know. What were we talking about? Where were we going with that? I'm sorry, I got distracted by Pixie in chat.
no, you're good. I'm just like sort of asking questions that maybe you can elaborate on.
Yeah, no, you're good.
I think you answered it pretty well.
Yeah.
Um,
Do we want
The
to?
only
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
the only like anecdote I have is the sports I've been participating in pretty much my whole life have been grappling sports. Um,
Oh,
and
really?
man, you will be hard pressed to find a more transphobic sporting environment than a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym.
Really?
I think it's just Joe Rogan just has too much influence over Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu culture for it to like
God damn.
to get past it. Yeah,
That's unfortunate. Wait, you said Brazilian?
yeah, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. It's like a grappling martial art.
Oh, damn. Oh, I thought you were saying that like you're from Brazil. I was like, oh shit. Well, then again, like
Oh no.
I used to have a friend who's from Brazil, so I guess it's not like out of the ordinary.
Yeah, I run into people from Brazil, but mostly at gyms, like
Yeah,
and stuff.
I gotcha. Everyone in MMA was spending too much time listening to Joe Rogan. Lol. Yeah, I get that.
True.
God, I don't know. I don't know how to feel about Joe Rogan because like I don't know. Sometimes he'll say like there have been like a very few small handful of times. Like there's been a small handful of times where he's actually like said something that makes me believe that he's not just like a bad faith actor. Like there's been like one or two times where he's actually put like there was one time he pushed back against like Ben Shapiro on like racist or like on systemic racism, and I was like, oh shit, I'm actually pleasantly surprised that you're meaningfully pushing back against someone who's like who's just like trying to say that systemic racism doesn't exist. Like, good on you. But then the rest of the time, I don't know. I like my genuine impression is that he's just someone who doesn't know anything, and that he ends
I think
up,
that's 100%.
yeah,
Right.
and
I
he
think
just
he's
ends
like
up platforming like a bunch of like he ends up platforming like the majority people, not everyone. Like there's a lot of people who he ends up bringing on who are just like celebrities and they just talk about whatever. But then he'll end up bringing on like more or most of the time people who are like large conservative figures, and they'll just end up like spewing the craziest shit to his audience. Like how big is his podcast at this point?
I mean, it's still the biggest podcast in the world.
Dear God.
Upward of 10 million plus views
Uh,
on different platforms each. Yeah. I mean, I've listened to a whole lot of Joe Rogan. I used to be fully on that sort of bandwagon, and I think that the best assessment I have of him is he isn't a bad actor, but he just sort of defaults to whatever is like most salient. So like for the like structural racism stuff, he's like, yeah, I mean like, there was slavery and there was Jim Crow and now we're here and that wasn't that long ago, so it's probably still there. Like I can see all that. But then when it comes to like trans issues, he's like, oh well, like that's a dude beating up a woman and I can see that, and he just sort of like ignores the fact that there's like that's not the case because it's just what he sees.
yeah.
And
No, I mean I get that. There's also the problem that he ends up bringing on a lot of people. Like I can't remember.
like-
I mean, like he's brought on several people who are pretty terrible. But I remember the last time I looked at one of his videos, like on stream when I was still doing like React Andrea stuff. He had on like Abigail Schreier. And if you aren't familiar with her, she wrote a book called "Irreversible Damage: The Transgender Craze
no.
Seducing Our Daughters." Which
no.
and if the title did not give you an indication of how the book is, or if you're literally just basing your opinion of the book off the title, then that probably honestly tells you everything you need to know about it. Because yeah, literally it's just a book talking about like it spreads. So there's a couple things about it, right? The first thing that it does primarily is that it's based off of like a debunked bad theory on gender, or specifically being like transness being a social contagion. Essentially, it's this idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, which was based off of a survey of not trans people, but the parents of trans people, specifically the parents of trans people who went to explicitly transphobic UK blogs. And
Yeah.
yeah, and it was essentially just like and essentially it based on what the study did was it took the survey results of the parents, and mind you, the survey was also presented in like a very disingenuous way, or like a lot of the questions were. But essentially what it did was it interpreted all of the parents saying something to the effect of, oh, my child never was trans before this. They never told me about anything. You know, and it definitely wasn't because, you know, they were hiding it from me or anything. No, it's like they definitely weren't trans before. And then they started watching these people on YouTube, and they saw these influencers, these trans influencers on Twitter.com. And then they suddenly went off to college where they weren't within my immediate grasp. And, oh my God, I hear that my daughter is a man now. And they concluded, and so essentially the study concluded, again, heavy quotation study, concluded that, oh, the reason that these children are saying that they're trans, and the study tends to focus specifically on trans men, or AMAP people, because that's a whole nother conversation. But essentially, like, it says, oh, these people aren't actually trans. Rather, what happened was they saw trans influencers, heavy quotations, on YouTube and Twitter and such, and they thought it was super fucking trendy, and that's the reason that they decided to become trans.
I think that's a great example of the sort of story that Joe Rogan will just go along with, like, every time.
Yeah, but I mean, like, that's and so back to the irreversible damage. It's basically an entire book based on that premise. Like, it's been talked about by a lot of, especially like trans guys on YouTube, some of whom were actually written about in the book, because yeah, and it's really weird because I mean, like, a lot of them I know now, and so it's just like it's honestly, like, once you get to like a certain size, like, I'm not even that big on YouTube, but I mean, like, I know a lot of people in the trans community, like even people who are like way bigger than me. Same for like politics YouTube, and so it's weird because like I see them written about in essentially like this TERF manifesto, and they're described simultaneously. Like, in one sentence, they're described as like these terrible cultists trying to convert daughters to become men and throw away their womanhood. And then in the next sentence, they're described as like, you know, helpless victims who are, or like helpless women who are victims of like occult brainwashing, you know? It's like they'll be described simultaneously as like terrible villains and then also as like the victims of like mass brainwashing, because the book cannot make up its mind. So yeah, so so that's the entire book. Wonderful. And that's the kind of shit that Joe Rogan will listen to in platform. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. The thing that strikes me about that example is that you sort of have this, you have two things. The first thing is that there's an increase in like trans representation and maybe positive representation in some social circle. And then another dynamic is an increase in people identifying as trans and transitioning. And Joe Rogan might see those two things and go, oh, okay, well, does someone have a thing that connects these? And someone comes along and goes, oh yeah, they're all being brainwashed. And he's like, oh yeah, I mean, I guess that could be, right? Like, these people are advocating for this, and then other people are following them. Like, that, all right, I'll take that.
Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
I mean, really only cares about what could explain it, not what does explain it.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, I could see how someone who knows literally nothing, and I mean, like, I guess, sure, that could be Joe Rogan. Probably is. I mean, like, I could see how someone who doesn't know anything about the subject could certainly come to that conclusion. I mean, like, a lot of people have recently, so for example, in some recent, I think there are census numbers, a lot of people are making a big deal about how there are more people who are identifying, especially as trans, but also otherwise as LGBT now than at any point in prior history. Mm-hmm. And that the amount of trans people who have come out now has increased dramatically over the past couple of years compared to like any point prior in history. And so people are looking at that and they're vaguely gesturing at it to imply, oh my God, look at all these people becoming trans now. It must be because it's a social contagion, or everyone's just thinking it's too fucking trendy, or our kids are being brainwashed, or et cetera, right? When the much more likely and I'm just going to say it right now, the actual explanation is that people, as it turns out, are a lot more likely to come out if you have a society which is a lot more accepting and willing to give you civil rights than otherwise, right? Like,
Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
like over the past couple of years, like, yeah, there's been a lot more trans people coming out. We've also seen, like, in the past, like, even just 5 years, like, one of the largest surges in, like, public awareness and, like, advocacy for the rights of trans people and otherwise LGBT people as well, right? Um, and so, yeah, it's absolutely no wonder that trans people are starting to come out more now, right? Like, people are able to see public representation that's more than just, like, a stereotype of being, I don't know, like Silence of the Lambs, Buffalo Bill, and all that shit, right? Like, people are actually able to start seeing themselves represented as, like, human beings, and not even just that, but, like, as role models, as, you know, people who are in politics or in television or who are going into professional fields, right? Like, this is a wonderful time to be a young trans person, to see all this positive representation. I mean, hell, a lot of people talk about Natalie, you know, and the fact that, like, she's able to go on and be one of the most popular political YouTubers on the merits of her own videos. Like, it's not like she was just given a bunch of, like, you know, oppression points because she's a trans
Yeah, there aren't a
woman
lot of
on the internet.
algorithms supporting
Yeah,
Natalie.
yeah, like, people authentically think, like, it is the genuine opinion of everyone who follows her, I assume, that she just makes the best content, you know? And that's really cool. Like, that's a really good role model for a lot of people. And so, yeah, no shit, more people are coming out. It's, I mean, for a shit time as it is to be alive, because also, side note, it also, like, to me, this also helps explain why as many people are starting to come out in opposition to it. Because, like, you know, historically, trans people have been able to be kind of relegated to, like, essentially, like, an undiscussed part of society. You know, it's like, oh, those are, you know, those are the people that, like, trans people didn't really need to be talked about beyond more than just, like, a general taboo. Because that's all that they were. They didn't need to be taken seriously. But now they're in public discourse. I say they, we. Are in public discourse enough now that it's like, now, you know, they can't just be shooed under the rug as, like, a taboo subject. Like, now they're, like, far out in front and, like, at the head of, you know, public discussion, right? And so now, because of that fact, people cannot ignore them, and a lot of the people who previously were ignoring them were not fans to begin with, right? And so rather than, like, you know, I don't see a lot of the recent pushback so much as, like, people becoming transphobic, more so than I see it as, like, people who already were, or at least had, like, the kind of beliefs that would lead someone to develop transphobic beliefs later on, were kind of, like,
Encouraged to confront those beliefs because there were more trans people around.
yeah, exactly. No, I think that's a really good way to put it, right? Like, essentially, the latency of their transphobia was brought to realization because now it's, like, an actually politically relevant issue. So yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. And then you have people like Joe Rogan, like, mind you, and I don't think that that's going to be, like, a ton of people, like, in the grand scheme of society. I think that a lot of people are just kind of like Joe Rogan, where it's like, this is something I don't really understand that much, but it's like, whatever. But he doesn't probably know as much about it either, right? And to someone who doesn't know any better, like, you hear trans women competing in women's sports, and that might make you, like, jar a little bit if you don't know as much, because that might come across, like, if you have been, like, if you have a preconceived notion that, like, trans woman equals man, then yeah, you're literally just, like, letting trans women in the women's sports. Same for, like, letting trans women in women's restrooms, so on and so forth. So to someone who doesn't know any better, like, I don't hold it against them too much necessarily, because they just don't know better. But, like, the problem for me is usually, like, there's a lot of people who, especially, like, the quasi-experts, like, for example, the Abigail Schreiers, right? The people who are smart enough and who have, like, done enough work in the area to know that most of their beliefs are bullshit. Because, like, a lot of these subjects are not, like, hidden information, right? Like, a lot of it's public knowledge. But, like, for those people who, like, reasonably should know that they're spreading misinformation and yet choose to do it anyway, those are people who I would probably say have, like, a higher degree of moral onus. So like the Ben Shapiros, the Abigail Schreiers, and like those people. Even like actually no, like especially the Blair Whites of the world, right? Because like with Blair White, I'm not sure if I've told you this, but like I know people who are like personally friends with Blair White, and essentially like she knows that. Fuck, don't attack me! God damn it! Like she knows that like most of the stuff that she spreads in her videos are absolutely bullshit. It's just that she knows it's what makes her money, so she says it anyway, even if she doesn't agree with it, right? For people like that, like, yeah, I think
I'm
that
sorry,
there's
you're gonna have to help me. I'm sure this is useless for your audience. Blair White is.
Sorry. All right, context. Blair White.
I'm so sorry. I'm not deep in online politics.
No, you're fine. Blair White is a super big trans YouTuber. She's probably the second largest as far as like political trans YouTubers, right behind Natalie or ContraPoints.
Wait, is this the woman that got on a I think it was a I don't remember the gender of the trans person that they like lambasted, and then basically they went after this person for competing in
Yes, you're thinking of the right
sports.
person.
They were
Yep.
totally wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
So no, Blair White
I
made a
didn't know this
video about Janae Kroc, trans person, trans like a professional athlete.
Oh yeah, weightlifter, right?
Yep. Yeah, weightlifter. Made a video going after Janae for competing in women's sports. But here's the kicker. Here's the interesting thing about this story. Janae Kroc has never competed in women's sports, or never competed in the way that that Blair White made her out to. So Blair just completely fucking lied. I mean, like, she does that very. So here's the thing about it is that like Blair often lies in her videos, or she's blatantly wrong. Actually, no. I can't say that she's wrong, because like, as we've already discussed, like there are like people who know her have told me that she knows that she spreads misinformation, but does it anyway because it's profitable. And so like, oh damn, why didn't I get where? Oh, gotcha. And so like, yeah, so like that's a really good example where like she did spread misinformation, and normally she isn't called out for it as much, but there it was just so blatantly obvious that like everyone on the internet came down on her, like collectively in one like unified swoop, right?
Yeah.
Which was which is pretty good, because oftentimes a really like another similar example where she spread information before was when she was talking about the Trump administration's decision to rescind the Obama era administration's laws or interpretations of federal law protecting trans people from discrimination in healthcare. So the Trump administration, we're getting into administrative law, so it gets complicated.
Yeah,
but
well,
essentially,
this is stuff I know way more about than Blair White.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna summarize. All right, here is your very, very quick primer on administrative law. Okay, Congress passes laws. They are not always very clear. So when Congress passes a law and there are areas where it's not clear how it is supposed to be interpreted, they will give the authority to the administrative branch, or the executive branch, basically to allow its own agencies that it creates to interpret and carry out the laws that Congress passes. Okay? And so what we had was, I believe it was Title IX. It's either Title VII or Title IX, so chat will correct me. One of those laws, the one which specifically concerns like protections from discrimination in healthcare, there's one area where, so basically like the law gives latitude for, or the law gives protection for people on the basis of sex, is I believe what it is. And so, but that can be a little bit vague, right? And so under the Obama administration, they interpreted that language in that law to mean that it provided protection to trans people from discrimination in the healthcare field, right? But When the Obama administration left, the Trump administration came in and changed their interpretation of the rule. And because they changed their interpretation, they changed how the agency was going to enforce that interpretation. And therefore, they took away protections that the previous administration had offered under the law. I'm sorry, I'm trying to condense down like administrative law, right? Does that make sense? Like essentially, Congress
It's gonna make
passed
sense to me either way, because I'm one paper away from a politics degree, but
oh damn. Okay,
hope
yeah. So
it
basically,
makes
like
sense.
you
Okay.
started out like Congress passed a law protection on the basis of sex and healthcare. Obama administration interpreted that law to mean to also include trans people. Trump administration came in, changed it so trans people were no longer protected. That's the long and short of it. And basically Blair White came up and said, like she made the video, she came out and actually even like wrote a blog post, like a new millennial post. So like it's supposed to look fancy, but it's just horseshit. And she was like, no, actually, the Obama administration rule was never even in effect to begin with because it was enjoined in the Texas case by a district court judge. So we never even had those protections to begin with. And I cannot even begin to tell you how fucking wrong she was. Like, holy shit. Like, this is almost on, like, that's almost on the level of like criminal misconduct. Insofar, or I should say like legal misconduct. I don't know if it would rise to the level of criminality. But the reason why is because specifically what happened was when a Texas judge did enjoin the rule against the HHS, which is the administration which would normally enforce the rule. But what she failed to include was that the ruling only enjoined the ruling against the HHS. And what that meant was, while the HHS couldn't bring claims for discrimination against trans people on the basis of that interpretation, individuals still could. If a trans person was individually discriminated against in a protected healthcare system or field, based on their gender identity, they could themselves bring a lawsuit under that rule. It was just that the HHS couldn't do that for them. So
Yeah,
when
'cause
Blair
obviously
came
HHS
out
was
and
not
said that
standing.
actually trans people didn't have that protection to begin with, she was blatantly wrong. She was absolutely wrong. But like no one really caught it because obviously, in case it's not apparent from the conversation, like in order to be able to suss all that out, you need like a decent amount of know-how as far as like legal knowledge and whatnot, right? Like I literally had to have that explained to me, I had to have that explained to me by a friend of mine who was on the board of directors for the National LGBT Bar Association, right? Like I had one of the preeminent scholars in this field explain this to me and how batshit wrong she was. But no one called her out for it. So I say all that just to say that like she lies all the time. That's another really good example. But she was only called out as much as she was with the Janae Kroc example because it was so blatant and obvious that no one could ignore it. Sorry, that was a lot of setup for that, but
No, you're good.
yeah.
I mean, I think that stuff is really important to know about.
Yeah. Unfortunately, though, that interpretation. So when the Trump administration came in and changed their interpretation, we lost that protection. So now we do not have it, but it should be coming back. I believe it's coming back under the Biden administration.
Fingers crossed.
Yep. So that's good. Good job, Biden. Yeah. But